So welcome to everyone. It is really such a pleasure to see this room so filled with the various generations of our congregation, to see in this room faces from people who are here from the very, very beginning, and also to see faces of relatively new members to our congregation who share a sense of connection and loyalty and passion for this place and want to learn more about how it began. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce and formally thank Dan Cedarbaum, who was really the visionary behind this program. But first, we were both struck, Dan and I, by the fact that today's program was really an embarrassment of riches, that even though there are a few panelists who will be sharing BHB's history, that there are so many more panelists that we could have had, because truly the only reason that Congregation Beth Hillel B'nai Emunah stands today is because of the visionary work of its founders, the individuals who are part of those formative early years, who had an idea for a Jewish community here in Wilmette and put their heart and soul, often their money, into making it happen, and we are so very, very grateful. So it's wonderful to be able to celebrate that history this morning. Without further ado, I want to introduce Dan Cedarbaum. As I mentioned, the entire idea for today's program came from Dan. Dan loves history and loves our congregation and wanted to bring those two pieces together, especially in celebration of our 60th this year. And it was really, he was the heart and soul and work behind today's event. Dan Cedarbaum is the executive director of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. Organized at the end of 2010 and based in Evanston, the Kaplan Center is a not-for-profit organization devoted to the transformation of Jewish community through the dissemination and promotion of the thought and writings of Mordechai Kaplan and the advancement of the agenda of the Kaplanian approach to Judaism in the 21st century from an explicitly trans-denominational perspective. From 2002 to 2006, Dan was the president of the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation and a member of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. During the past few years, Dan has spent considerable time studying the history of non-Orthodox Judaism in post-World War II America, importantly, including the history of BHBE and other synagogues. Dan is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. He became a member of BHBE about 18 months ago, but wishes that he had joined sooner, and we wish he had too. So with no further ado, Dan Cedarbaum.
Thank you. Boker Tov, it's wonderful to see all of you. So. I'm going to begin with some important words of thanks, first of all, to everyone here at Beth Hillel Congregation B'nai Emunah, to Rabbi Tucker, to Marsha Lyons, to Ellie Bauman, Aaron Frankel, Jackie Ernest, and Percy Ferguson, who all provided particularly important support for this program. I'm glad to see Sandy Goldberg is here because he prepares to assume the presidency because the past is indeed prologue, or so I'm going to claim, and it's always a pleasure and privilege to have Rabbi Kensky with us, who is in the audience, I think. He's on the side. I've been referring with Rabbi Kensky to this as Beth Hillel BK, that is before Kensky. It's really BL. Before Lincoln, and there's much more to cover. But today we're going to look at the first 15 years or so. The title, "A Synagogue Blooms Where Once Was a Wilderness," is in fact the title of an article that appeared in the Jewish Sentinel. Some of you were here when I gave the so-called guest sermon in January, and I quoted at length from that article that talked about the amazing growth of this relatively new congregation from 1958 to 1965. We have amazing panelists who you're going to meet in just a few minutes. I'm just going to go down the row. Ira Hyman, Judy T-Blum-Mishkin, Sheila Gideon, Shelley Moss, and very importantly, Dr. Irving Cutler, who in addition to being a longtime Beth Hillel Congregation B'nai Emunah member, is here really to provide the important historical perspective. I am a serious but totally amateur historian. He, of course, is Chicago Jewry's most important professional historian. I have to mention in particular from the founding years, and first of all, one of the co-founders, Serene Myers, is here from 1958. Dali Molin, whom the records say joined in later, but that can't be. It has to be before 1964, right? 1960, yeah, just after. Sashi Kraft, who joined, I believe, in 1964, and her son Jeremy are here. and I think Harold and Carol Green may be here from that. So we begin, of course, in 1958 on the left, and I realize, and we will add lots of different columns and rows to this, but right now we've got rabbis, cantors, and you'll see there's no cantor at the very beginning. Someone will correct me if I've got this wrong. I'm sure there are people who led services as cantors, but no regular cantor. Synagogue presidents in green below, the year, obviously, and then just for the obvious but important American historical context, who the U.S. president was at the time. So obviously we begin with Rabbi Louis Leibowitz. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. In 1958, we're in the Eisenhower administration, and we're going to go slower, and we move across. Between Rabbi Leibowitz and Rabbi Saul Landau, there was somebody, David Graubart, whom you'll see referred to, and some of you may remember, who, as far as I can tell, but somebody will have to correct me if I'm wrong, was really an interim rabbi. He was actually the head for a long time of the then conservative Beit Din in Chicago. Then Rabbi Landau, and you see the first cantor, Jerome Clement, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, who's no longer with us. And then just continuing to move across, Rabbi William Frankel, Cantor Irving Zummer, who, keep going. Yeah, it's not cooperating, sorry. So Cantor Zummer, very interestingly, is as far as I can tell, the oldest living professional here. He is alive and well at 92 in West Palm Beach. I've made contact with him, and I'm looking forward to being able to capture some of his recollections. He, in addition to being here, was, I believe, the very first cantor at what was then the Niles Township Jewish Congregation. He was also at Temple Beth Israel before it moved to Skokie. So again, this will be a lot easier to follow as we move across to Rabbi Hammer, who then Robert Hammer, now Reuven Hammer, who is, of course, alive and well in Israel. Rabbi David Lincoln. This is sort of the post-era with Cantor Meir Finkelstein. Cantor Reitman asked me to do one thing this morning, which is not forget the importance of the cantors. And Meir Finkelstein, as some of you may know, went on. This was his very first job. He came here right from Israel, and he's gone as a very young cantor. He's gone on to a very illustrious career, both as a composer and a cantor. I think he had connections to both. But we'll have to check that. Thank you. This is exactly the kinds of things we're going to resolve. Among the this first group of presidents, until we get to Mr. Moss, who's of course with us today, as far as I can tell, the one and only one who is living, and of course Sam Pfeffer, is Harvey Field. I'll say one of the things that's fascinating to me about the obvious connections to the American historical situation, well, two things I'll mention just very briefly. First, does anybody remember, it's in one of the articles posted outside the sanctuary in the hall, who spoke at the dedication of the first new building in 1962, who was the guest academic speaker? Anybody see the article? Well, the answer is they brought in a space scientist from Case Western, which of course was entirely appropriate in early 1962. And the other very obvious and important connection to what's going on in the broader society is that, as some of you know from experience, some of you may know from history, Rabbi Frankel was very involved in the civil rights movement, particularly in the South. And indeed, his most well-known sermon, because it was published in a lot of places online, is called A Rabbi in Dixie, which he gave in April of 1965, shortly after returning from the march from Selma to Montgomery. And of course, we think of Abraham Joshua Heschel being there, and he was, and Everett Gendler was there, Alex Schindler from the Reform Movement, but Rabbi Frankel from Beth Hillel was very much a part of that contingent of clergy who marched. I want to start in 1956 and turn to Mr. Moss, shall we? Here. You've written a bit about this, so tell us a little bit about what it was like to be one of these 25 families newly arrived in Western Wilmette that wanted to form a synagogue, it decided.
Thank you very much. Boker Tov, everybody. Beth Hillel is celebrating its 60th anniversary. I have been a member for 62 years. And if you're wondering why the 2 years, it took a lot of legal work to make the village of Wilmette understand that a synagogue was about to be born. It took 2 years for them to approve of us. And so those 2 years went by, and thank God we're here today. I have served under all past 10 rabbis who have occupied this pulpit. I have served practically in every capacity a layperson could undertake in synagogue life. President, executive vice president for 4 years, membership chairman, building chairman, fundraising chairman for both the school and the sanctuary, 40 years on the board of directors, chairman of the board, chairman of long-range planning committee. I was one of the 25 families who founded Beth Hillel in the recreation room of B. and Jules Schwegman, who lived on Wilshire Drive. Each served as president of sisterhood and congregation, respectively. As time went on, the congregation started to grow, and we knew that close to 800 member families were about to face us. And so we decided that it was time to search for property. We rented space above the pool hall located on the corner of Wilmette Avenue and Lake Street. Our office and meeting room became our home. The First Congregational Church of Wilmette offered us 2 classrooms for our students to make use of. Highcrest School Auditorium became our temporary home for Shabbat and some of the Hagim. A B'nai B'rith Lodge was the only thing Jewish to identify with in the community. Eden's Expressway was not completed. Old Orchard was not completed except for a theater and a bowling alley. The congregation membership was nearing 800 families. The school enrollment increased proportionately. We knew that it was inevitable for us to have to build and have our own home. And this is what we did. We went out and priced property, which was going rapidly at that time. Wilmette had an influx of families. East Wilmette was already taken. West Wilmette was being filled up, thank goodness, with a lot of Jewish families. And so what we did was we went shopping, and we decided that there was a piece of property located right across from a chalet. It was on the corner of Lake and Skokie Highway, which has a filling station there right now. We bought that piece of property, but it was the biggest mistake we ever made. Because when you came right down to it, if we would have done our homework, we would have known that a building and schoolyard and parking, impossible to put on that piece of property. And so what we did was we fell in luck with something. People who own this property right here came to us and said, we'll make you a deal. We'll swap our land for yours. And that's what happened. And it was the greatest favor that ever happened for us. As you can see for yourself, we would have never been able to live on that corner. I want to tell you one thing. I've been here for many years. I've seen a lot of people come and go. My heart and soul is with this congregation and will always be. Thank you.
So I have to ask you, many people know this, but what was the address of that first place on Wilmette Avenue?
1213 Wilmette Avenue.
Yeah. And so everyone know what the phone number of Beth Hillel is? 256-1213, that's where it comes from. So I'm now going to turn to Dr. Cutler. I know there are a million things you could say, but a little bit of context of the move to suburbia, and then we'll come back to some questions about, as this happens, putting the move of these families who came, as I understand, from the north side, from the south side, from the west side, all arrived in West Wilmette in the mid-50s.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you know that after World War II, there was a movement outward from the city to the suburbs. Not only Jews, but all the different groups. Some of the Jewish neighborhoods after the war were beginning to change. Lawndale, which was the largest Jewish neighborhood by far in the late 1940s and early 50s, was changing racially. And it was an area where there were no single-family homes. The people lived in two-story buildings, three-story buildings, apartment buildings, and the trend was for people to have a home of their own. It was after the war. It was sort of a prosperous period. The government made good loans to the veterans, and so people started moving out looking for better amenities, better schools, a home of their own, a lawn of their own. And so the people started moving, and one of the prime areas where they moved to was Wilmette. It was just north of Jewish neighborhoods in Albany Park and West Rogers Park, and until the 50s, it was basically farmland. From Hunter Avenue westward, it was full of farms. In fact, the last farm, the Lesh Farm, which is located where the Centennial building is now, closed in the 1970s. This area had a number of advantages. For one, Eden's Expressway came through in 1951, and some of you may remember that about a block west of the synagogue, there was a commuter railway station, the Chicago North Shore Milwaukee Railway. It had the Glen Air station there. And I lived on Hill Lane, which is about a half a block north of the Shul. And when I worked downtown, I could walk to the station and commute by the transit system to the downtown area. Now, just north of the synagogue, there was a landscaper named Gehrig who owned a big part of the land just to the north of the synagogue. And the kids of the area used to play there, but he was sort of a mean man, and when they saw him, why, they ran away from him. In fact, my house was adjacent to his landscape, and he said my fence was 2 inches over on his lot, and he wanted me to move it, and I refused. I thought I was legally okay. So what he did, he started piling compost up against the fence, and it really began to smell, so eventually I moved the fence. Now, when the Jews started moving into the area, the block that I live on, Hill Lane, there was a Jewish developer. In fact, there were a number of Jewish developers who advertised in Jewish newspapers, and that's one of the reasons Jews came out into the area. There was Hollywood, there was I. Simon. On my street, I. Simon, which is Hill Lane, built 50 homes. And initially, I think about 90% of them were Jewish. And we used to have Jewish block parties. We had poker games every week for the men. Now, as part of the trend, the block has changed. It's about half Jewish, and a lot of Asians live on the block. And to the right of me is an Iranian family. To the left of me is a woman who's from Peru, and her husband is English. Now, among the early Jewish facilities in the area, there was a little store, a little delicatessen called Karen's Pantry. Some of you may remember it, where the Chabad synagogue is now. And then another facility, which also is no longer here, was Ashkenaz Restaurant. You know, the famous restaurant from Moore Street. It was on Lake, just opposite of Eden's Plaza. That just lasted a couple years and didn't make it. So that was basically some of the the trends. The funeral home came in 1970, and the Jews started moving into the area in the 1950s, and in a matter of 10 years or so, the whole area became Jewish. And because there were a lot of Jewish kids, the city built schools. There were 3 new schools built in the area. Bell, Ramona, and Locust were all built in the 1950, late 1950, 1960s. So that's a little bit about the early history of this area. Thank you.
So, as I understand it, and again, folks will correct me if I'm wrong, what these 25 original families and those who soon joined them to create Beth Hillel really had in common was they were almost all young married couples with lots of young children. And what the real motivation is, so how often happens with the creation of a community like this, or the first motivation, is to create educational facilities, particularly a Hebrew school of some kind for the kids. And then from that, a synagogue forms. One of the questions I've asked as I've done informal interviews with several of the very early members is whether consideration was given to joining another synagogue in the area. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but Beth Hillel at 50, being formed in 1958, is still very early in the creation of synagogues, at least non-Orthodox synagogues, on the North Shore. You have in 1947 North Suburban Bethel. That is clearly the oldest and way up, of course, in almost a different world in Highland Park. Then in 1952, Niles Township. In 1953, as we said, B'nai Amuna, which would have been the closest, I suppose, for those who want, at least for those who were willing to drive on Shabbat then to get to. From 1955, interestingly, what became Mikdash El Hagro Hebrew Center at the time was actually called the Conservative Congregation of Evanston, although for those who know where the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation is, that was the site of Mikdash El, which is as much in Rogers Park, and I think in terms of the congregation was, as in Evanston, and very much the same with the Sephardic congregation that stands on Howard Street, which is technically in Evanston, but is really a Chicago synagogue. The importance of Mikdash El in the history of this community, as Shelley at least and Serene may recall, is because they were merging with, originally it was just Mikdash El, and then there was a Hebrew Institute Hagro, and that is a very Ashkenazic pronunciation of Hagra, meaning the Vilna Gaon, because they were merging. Rabbi Lieberworth, the first rabbi here, saw the writing on the wall, I think, and was looking for a job when you were looking to hire. So that's how those two synagogue histories intersect. I want to turn to Ira because you can either stand here or sit either way, because you were born in 1948. You were kind enough to reveal to me, and then you grew up here, right?
I definitely grew up here. I think that I am, and I hate to use the term oldest, but oldest second generation member of Beth Hillel. My family moved to Wilmette in August of 1960, just shy of my 12th birthday, 1 month later. And I came here, so this is from the point of view of a 12-year-old, went to Hebrew school, started Hebrew school, but the memories that I have, the first memory of Beth Hillel was going up to that office that Shelley talked about on the corner of Green Bay and Wilmette Avenue. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you, Shelley, and Severin T. Bloom sat down with my parents, talked to them about becoming members, which they eventually did. A little bit of family history is that my mother was very, very active. Both of my parents were active, but my mother was extremely active at Beth Hillel. She was vice chairman of the gift shop, and boy, the memories of being young and having to go with her to the houses because we didn't have anywhere to have gift shop, and she'd go to the sisterhood meetings, and my older brother and myself, we'd be schlepping these cartons of giftware, which we hated. I mean, we just couldn't stand it. But that was my mother. She, with her sister of blessed memory, Shirley Glickoff, they were impactful in the sisterhood. They were impactful, not just to sisterhood, but they were impactful to the congregation. My mother eventually became president of sisterhood, and then at the request of Rabbi Frankel, she started catering here at Beth Hillel. And in the years that she was the caterer of the congregation, and I'm talking about the late 70s through the 80s, she earned over $1.25 million, and that's of $1970 and $1980, which was significant. Other congregations, like families from Bethel and Highland Park, and congregations in Skokie would come to Beth Hillel for their affairs, for their parties, for their affairs, and it was just unbelievable. But getting back to my 12-year-old perspective, when I was 12 years old, it started out rough for me personally. I came from the west side of Chicago, changing neighborhood, and it was pretty rough there. And then I come to Wilmette, and I have to touch on this, and I'm only going to touch on it lightly. The anti-Semitism from the children, we'll call them children, teenagers, adolescents, was incredible. And there almost wasn't a day when I was at Hebrew school at Highcrest, there almost wasn't a day that I wasn't in a fight with a group of anti-Semitic kids. I mean, it just was a regular thing. The only problem was that I was there and everybody else ran into the school. So I'm sitting there defending our honor, and I held my own. I was also part of the very first youth group softball team, and we competed in the church league, we were the youngest group in the church league because the men's club of Beth Hillel was a team involved in that, as well as the churches around. And that's another place where there was a lot of anti-Semitism. They loved to step on our hands when we were sliding headfirst into a base, things like that. But I just wanted to touch on that lightly because it had an impact on me for the rest of my life and how I feel about my relations with other people in the world. But going forward, it was an unusual experience because I came from the west side of Chicago to be in an area where people were smart, not that they were stupid on the west side, but it was just a different culture, and it really motivated me to be a better person. And eventually I went on to college, so I lost the context of being a part of Beth Hillel. I still came here for holidays, high holidays and things. But those impactful years, it was really, it was wonderful and it was tough at times. But I made it. I'm still here. And I enjoy being here every Shabbat, every day that I am involved, which is 58 years.
So you celebrate your bar mitzvah, yes?
Highcrest School was where my bar mitzvah was. That was Sal Landau.
What are your earliest memories? Do you have memories of Rabbi Landau and then Rabbi Hammond?
The only thing I remember about Rabbi Landau is when I was facing him after I read my Haftorah, the usual shtick that goes on. And just looking, he had this very dark, long, not hippie long hair, but he had long hair, and he would always take the front and he'd go like this, and he's talking to me, and he's going like this. And so that was kind of strange. And the other thing about my bar mitzvah, and I said this a couple of years ago when I was celebrating the anniversary of my bar mitzvah, is we had the party right after the service, right at Highcrest School. And what did my mother serve? My bar mitzvah, I'm supposed to be the special person. She served whitefish. Now, I hate whitefish. I don't eat whitefish. To this day, I don't eat whitefish. And not only that, The second thing I dislike the most is beet borscht. Well, what did she have? She had a fountain, beet borscht fountain. And I don't even know how any of my friends who I invited to even had anything to eat. And I don't remember the dessert, but getting back to Rabbi Frankel, I didn't have much of a relationship with him because I was already in college and getting married, things like that. And Rabbi Hammer married me the first go-round.
Thank you. So, just a few more words of background. According to the American Jewish Yearbook, in 1958, the greater Chicago area Jewish population was 282,000. What's fascinating is the latest numbers, and Dr. Keller may have more recent ones that I've seen, which are more or less from 2014, show 291,800. So overall, is almost exactly the same. I haven't bothered. I should put that in the context of the total population of the metropolitan area, but I think it's interesting how close those numbers are. The other thing I want to just mention briefly, Rabbi Landau, I mentioned Rabbi Lieberworth coming from Evanston and leaving. Not sure where he went next. But Rabbi Landau both came from Cleveland, from a very important synagogue to American Jewish history called the Park Synagogue, which Rabbi Solomon Goldman had served earlier, and then Rabbi Armin Cohen, I think, set some kind of record by being the rabbi more or less for 70 years. In any case, Rabbi Landau both came from a position as assistant rabbi there, or associate rabbi, and went back to a position, or as the Sentinel said, was called back to Cleveland. He then ended up in Florida, which I understand. I think Shelley told me it was in part, at least for health reasons, or maybe for his wife's health reasons. So now, turning to Judy T. Bloom Mishkin. As many of you know, I don't want to play favorites or suggest there aren't a ton of important families, but I think it's fair to say the T. Blooms and the Molines, who are well represented here. I know your brother Joel is here, and in addition to Dolly, we have Rich Moline and Mindy Moline, and I'm sorry, I know you have a married name, but I'm referring to you as Mindy Moline. And Rabbi Jack Moline threatened to come, but he had a speaking engagement in Virginia. I did talk to him this morning. And so, Judy, you were born into the congregation, either sitting or standing, either way. If you could just talk a little bit about what that was like and your earliest memories of the place.
Okay. So first of all, when Dan reached out to me and said, "Would you do this?" I said, "You got the wrong girl. I'm too young. I don't have the memories." But the more I think about it, well, first I would just want to start by saying, know before whom you stand. And I stand before the people who created the landscape of my childhood and planted the seeds that are the foundation of my Jewish life. And he didn't know that T. Blooms, some of us cry when we talk, so I'm feeling pretty sentimental. But I want to acknowledge that, I had the good fortune to be born into and not face the anti-Semitism you faced, born in 1962, born in my house in Wilmette, born into the synagogue. And the synagogue I'm flooded with memories, so I'm just going to paint a few pictures. First, my facetious self was like, well, I could tell you where to play hide and go seek in the 60s. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought what I remember is running around with other children, and some of them are here, Michelle and Mindy and Randy and Lisa Shiner's not here, and Annette Rivlin, Marla Fox, Janice Pies, and Jerry Gideon also, running into the kitchen and getting a cookie from Sarah Berkowitz, from your mother, from Muriel Hyman, from Annette Seidenberg. You aged out on the cookie thing at some point. Remembering that it was such a safe place that all the adults co-parented us. We grew up in that time where, if you were a little out of line, you could be told lovingly that you were a little out of line. And if you were crying or hurt, a parent embraced you. So I have so much memory of love and security and just not realizing all the work that went into the community, all the seeds that were planted, a group of like-minded people with shared values, worked really hard and created this beautiful place for us. I have beautiful memories of Esther Moss, the Lifshitzes, just so many families that were the landscape of my childhood. But I also want to acknowledge that my uncle was the one who sort of brought my father along into this journey to some extent. But my father was, like a Baal Tshuva. He embraced it and then some. And that kind of hard... Oh, Severin Tebelum is my uncle, my father, Maury Tebelum. My mom, Edith, was super involved in the adult education. That was her passion. Annette shared a memory of sitting in synagogue and playing with her father seat on his tallis, and I thought that image was so powerful. And I remember sitting in the men's club auditorium in the old building, found like a little rip in my tights, started pulling at it. My mother looked down, half my tights were gone, and after that, I was allowed to bring my little kittles after that. But anyway, a story about my father being really tough on the fundraising. After he died, our neighbor came over. I won't say his name. And he said, when I moved to the neighborhood, which was probably in the 70s, your father came over, he introduced himself. He said, are you going to join a synagogue? And I said, no, and he never spoke to me again. That's the kind of guy my dad was when it came to Beth Hillel. You were either on or off the bus. So I think that's really mostly what I want to say, that there was so much love, there was so much, such a strong sense of community. And when you're an adult and you realize how much work it takes to build that community for your children, you realize what a debt of gratitude you have to those who come before you.
Before you sit down, just say a word about which rabbi and perhaps which cantor you first remember and what you remember.
Yeah. So it's funny because this is a year for me to remember things through the lens of my childhood, big anniversaries in my family and in my synagogue. So some of my memories are by proxy. So I know that Rabbi Landau named me. I don't remember that, but I know that my father wanted to name me for Judith in the Bible, not for a family member. My middle name, I'm Yehudit Chaya, and it was with Rabbi Landau's coaxing that he named me for a strong feminist character. I do remember Rabbi Frankel very warmly. I know that during the years where things were shifting in the synagogue, my parents were preoccupied with their own problems, my brother's illness, and so they stayed out of that mix, and we're very glad they stayed out of that mix. I think that's... And I remember Cantor Zummer with great, great fondness.
I'll tell him.
Yeah.
Thank you. So... I know I'm doing this a little piecemeal, filling in. So just so everybody's clear, the first building, which we now, I think, generally refer to as the school wing, was completed, in 1963, right? And that it was the synagogue. The men's club, so-called, was the sanctuary. And the wing we're in, the new building, relatively, was completed in 1971. I have a clipping from the Chicago Tribune from June 27, 1971. The trumpets, it's an $880,000 sanctuary. I'm sure Shelley remembers that. Rabbi Frankel, who's now been mentioned, is very interesting. His story is very interesting. We can't do justice to it today. He's one of the two rabbis Beth Hillel has had who did not go to the Jewish Theological Seminary. Rabbi Lincoln, like a lot of English rabbis, was ordained vaguely Orthodox by vague institutions in the United Kingdom. Sorry, that's a little bit of a slur. British Judaism is absolutely fascinating and very different in many ways from American Judaism. Rabbi Frankel's story is even more interesting. He came here as the latest in a chain of very famous Hasidic rabbis. They escaped from Eastern Europe first to Vienna, as I recall, before the war, long before the war, the Second War. Ended up trapped there. He experienced Kristallnacht, or its ramifications, as a young boy in Vienna. His family escapes finally in 1939 or 1940 under a very interesting provision of the obviously very restrictive still U.S. immigration laws that allowed rabbis offered jobs to escape the quotas that would otherwise apply. And I'm told that a number of rabbis in the United States resigned their pulpits in a concerted effort to help get job offers to some of these rabbis. Unfortunately for Rabbi Frankel and his family, his father got one of those job offers, a small synagogue in western New York. They quickly made their way. They restored the old rabbi to the pulpit, quickly made their way to New York City. where Rabbi Frankel ended up a student at Yeshiva University. How and exactly why, after being ordained as an Orthodox rabbi, he not only left the Orthodox world, but moved far to the left within the conservative world of the time, again, is a fascinating story that I've been looking at for some time, don't quite understand fully. As I said, he got very involved in the civil rights movement. Lots of other things happened here. And as many of you know, in 1968, one of the early traumas of Beth Hillel's history occurs when Rabbi Frankel and some number of members, I've heard enormously varying figures, leave to form what's originally not called Am Yisrael, but soon becomes Am Yisrael, which of course is alive and well under the leadership of Rabbi Newman Kamen in Northfield today. So with that, and speaking of 1968, Sheila Gideon and you and Vern joined in 1968, you tell me. I don't know if you caught the end of Rabbi Frankel's tenure or came under Rabbi Hammer, but I'd love you to talk a little bit about your recollections as a new member, and particularly if you're comfortable, I hope you are, what it means for someone who's now so ritually active as a woman in this synagogue, who's ritually active and as a woman, I should say, to have walked into a situation that was completely non-egalitarian, right? Or almost completely at the time.
Thank you. And I have to say, even though we've been members so long, I've really learned a lot by listening to my predecessors here on the program. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we moved here in 1968. We were a young family. We had 2 little kids, and we were looking for a house of our own. And we looked in various suburbs, and one of the attractions of Wilmette, of course, was that my brother Alan and Ellen, his wife, lived here. So that was a plus. It really was a plus. So we moved here in summer of 1968 and immediately joined the shul. There was already a close bond, I think, among the people who had joined the shul before. We were one of the young families that joined, and we found some others, namely Audrey and Al Shiner, had children our age, and we became friends and shared holidays together. May they both rest in peace. Their children are living and well, and we still keep in touch with them. So we needed a Hebrew school for our then 6-year-old and our coming 4.5-year-old. And I didn't expect any egalitarian synagogue because there weren't any. We came the same time that Rabbi Hammer came. And unlike today, the rabbi and his family were contemporaries of us. They had little children, we had little children, and that's a very different situation now than what we find. So Al Shiner, who was the ritual chairman, was very interested in having the synagogue become more egalitarian. And by that time, Rabbi Hammer had left. He had made Aliyah to Israel, and Rabbi Lincoln was here. Al Shiner asked me if I would consider doing a haftarah, which I had learned to do in our own tiny little synagogue, also named Beth Hillel, in Portage Park, Chicago. So we did this thing in the summer, and it was, I guess, a glass ceiling breaker. I made a shehechianu after doing it, and Rabbi Lincoln kind of looked a little bit askance at that. But that began a whole trend in the synagogue to making us egalitarian. Then came... I even remember what I wore. So after that, women counted in the minyan, women davened. By the time our daughter Randy, who I'm proud to say is a member of the synagogue and is here today, when she had her bat mitzvah, the girls celebrated their benot mitzvah on a Friday night. They did not do a haftarah. They did something. What did you do, Randy? You did a haftarah. Yes, you did. You did. But by the time Randy's younger sister, 4.5 years later, had her bat mitzvah, it was Saturday morning, just the way the boys were. So that's a little bit about the feminist movement here. Would you like to know other things? Well, you know, there is a tree in the hall that has rocks and leaves, and they commemorate different events in people's lives. We have one of the rocks, and what we said there was, in appreciation of the role that Beth Hillel played in our lives, which is huge. It's our country club, it's our kahila, it's where our children learned about being Jewish. It's still where we have such a beloved group of people who we've known for so long and have celebrated happy occasions with, and unfortunately tried to offer comfort when things were not so happy. So in recognition of that fact, there are also many leaves for our children and grandchildren's simchas, and we hope to be a continued part of this beautiful organization for many years to come.
Thank you.
I also wanted Jerry and Judy to find each other, and they did, but not in the way that I thought.
Okay. Rabbi Hammer told me that he would have liked to push for more rapid change on the inclusion of women, but didn't feel the synagogue was ready. He told me that in his recollection, women were reading Torah, or some woman had read Torah during his tenure. He may be misremembering, but the big question was allowing women to counting women in the minyan, which, well, that was his recollection, that maybe once anyway. And he saw that as a first step, not even with the blessing, but just reading. And he would have liked to push for the counting of women in the minyan, but felt it was too soon. Just to get, yes, ma'am.
I would like to say that in 1979, women were not counted in the minyan.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it took a while. Just to get personal for 1 second, as I mentioned in January, one of the reasons I think I'm tied to the history of this congregation is that I was born just a few months after Beth Hillel. And my bar mitzvah, which occurred in a big conservative synagogue in New York in 1972, I, as was typical in that synagogue, did not read Torah either. Some people said if you went to day school, which I did not, you got to read Torah. In any case, most of us read a portion of the Haftorah, usually shared with one or more other kids, boys. But we did not read. I didn't read Torah until much later. So, Shelley, before we open this up for questions, you said you had one remark. You want
A bit of nostalgia. You've heard the name of Severin T. Bloom. Severin was president, and I was his executive vice president.
What year was that?
That was going back to, whatever, somewhere around there. Anyways, make a long story short, we would see each other every day, all through the years that he was president. We were like brothers, morning, night, passing this synagogue, making sure that there was no hanky-panky, which at one time there was, but I won't get into that. Severin, no, this was a bad story. It was about non-Jews being in this congregation when the lights were out, but I won't go into it. But Severin, at a board meeting, got up and said, I want you to know I'm leaving on a trip for Israel. I'll be gone for several weeks, and I made the congregation the recipient of $100,000 insurance, so in case anything happens to me, you'll be the recipient. And everybody was proud and gave him an audience, clapping and whatnot. Well, the weeks went by. Severin comes to the next board meeting and somebody says, "You're back?" That's all.
It's a great story, and it also, I heard from you and Sam and Serene, this feeling that the founders really treated Beth Hillel, felt about Beth Hillel very much as a child, and that sort of confirms it, even to the extent of life insurance.
I shouldn't be going into this, but I will. As we well know, and it's a very touchy situation that you touched upon in terms of anti-Semitism in this community, there were only two prominent Jewish families living here on the lakefront. One was Lester Crown, and another gentleman by the name of Sam Goldman, who owned the theater in the Teatro del Lago, no man's land. He gave us that theater one year for the High Holy Days, free of charge. But that isn't the point. I get a call on a Shabbos morning from a rabbi who says, "Shelley, you know I can't go, but the police just called me." I says, "What is it, Rabbi?" He says, "Somebody broke into our synagogue and they found them, two boys. and they got shopping bags full of stuff, and I want you to go there. I said, I will. I got dressed up and went down to the police station, and here's two young boys with shopping bags. What have they got in them? Crowns from the Torah. They cut all the microphones off the bima and a few other religious objects. And the police said, where are you going? Or where are you coming from? They said, we're coming from a bar mitzvah, which was ridiculous. They brought them down to the police station, called the rabbi who called me, and I said to the policeman when I was talking to him on the phone, look, this is Shabbos. I will be down at your station tomorrow, and I want you to do me a favor. I want you to have the boys there. I want you to have their parents there, and I'll bring my attorney with me. And that was all set up. That morning we came and met. The two fathers were CEOs of corporations in Chicago. They were people who were in the know. And the two boys were there. And one father says to me, look at Mr. Moss, we'll have our boys work in your congregation to work off whatever the damage was. And they'll clean up and do whatever you want them to do. And I said to him, absolutely not. I said, do you want your boys to grow up with a stigma of what the Jews did to them during their lifetime growing up? I said, it's the worst thing in the world. I said, what I'm going to do is we're going to have a bill for you. And we're going to get together all the expenses to put everything back in place. And you're going to give us a check. To make a long story short, that's the way it worked out. But anti-Semitism in this community at one time was running rapid, but really rapid. I went into a grocery store when I first moved in, a little mama and papa shop on Green Bay Road in Lake. It's not there anymore. It was during Christmas time. And the gentleman who owned the store had a Christmas tree lot right next door, to his grocery. And the place was crowded. People were shopping. My wife said to me, you've got to go get groceries because the house is empty. We just moved in. I said, fine. And there were no large grocery operations around here at that time. Make a long story short, I bought some groceries, went to check out. The gentleman says to me, did you get your Christmas tree yet, sir? And I said, I'm not of that faith, but thanks for asking. And all of a sudden, you can cut the air with a knife. There's a Jew here. And I walked out, and I said to my wife, don't you ever send me to the grocery store again.
Well, I think Dr. Cutler wanted to.
I just wanted to say, Sheldon mentioned Severin T. Bloom. He lived right across the street of me on Hill Lane, and he was the one who one day came knocking on the door and said, we're organizing the synagogue, and you have to join. And he was a salesman, an insurance salesman. He was, I couldn't say no to him. And he asked me if I could kick in some money, and I had 2 kids and a big mortgage, but he twisted my arm and I kicked in some money.
Can you hold up just a little bit? Yes. I want to get to questions. We'll have a chance to. Jeremy, can I ask you to help? If you could, I want to open this up, but we have to use the mic. So Jeremy Kraft, of course, is Sashi's son and also an important early member. So it often happens at these events. I'm asking you to pass the mic. So questions, comments. Comments are okay, but please make them brief.
We're the Silver Glades. No. We're the Silver Glades.
Just hold the mic close to your mouth.
We're the Silver Glades.
Tell us when you joined.
We're the Silver Glades, and we live across the street lived for 40 years. We were the stop during recess, where all the children would come for an open pantry. But I also have to tell you, living across the street from the show, we had called the police many, many times and even chased vandals away from the show during the high holidays. So we too experienced. The landscape owner would tell us that he was very upset that he sold the property. Whether that was true or not, we didn't know. But he would threaten the kids at the end of the block when we just had 6 homes.
All right. In 1964,
I'm sorry, if you're comfortable, say who you are and when you joined?
We joined in 1965. In 1964, came in to look for a house when we were in the Air Force. Look for a house, and I went with a real estate, Quinlan and Tyson, and we drove down Lake Street, and she pointed to the north side of Lake Street and looked at me and said, "You wouldn't be very comfortable there." And of course, the gerrymandering to get New Trier West and New Trier East, where when we moved in on our street, which is Meadow Drive, which is exactly in the center of the village, part of the street could go to east, the other part to west. At the beginning, they gave you a choice, but then it was gerrymandered so that certain homes could go east, certain homes could go west.
There was a hand.
In 1960, I'm Dolly Moline. In 1960, we were looking to move because I had the third child was a baby, my lovely daughter Mindy, who's sitting here, and it's a mother for you. What are you going to do? And we had to move out of the apartment, which was small, and so I got a call from my husband's aunt, Lil Prochep. Lil was the treasurer at Beth Hillel. And she said, "You've got to move here. We're building a synagogue. We've got a synagogue. You've got to move here. It'll be wonderful for the children." And so we did. We looked and found this wonderful home built by Irv Margolin, whose wife still belongs to the congregation. And she's a lovely woman. And we still live here all these years. The children went to New Trier High School, which is why we moved here, for their education. We had a friendship second to none with the people who moved in and lived here with their children. And my children are still friendly with some of their children. There's a couple of them sitting right in front of me. Raise your hands, girls. They are, it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful time in the life of the Jewish people who moved in and the growth of Beth Hillel. And I, by the way, I have to dispute you, Sheila. I had the first Aliyah because I came to say Kaddish, and I wasn't allowed to say Kaddish because there weren't 7 men. And I got so angry. 10 minutes, excuse me. I walked out, and the men followed me, and they said, "Don't leave, don't leave. We loved Herb. He was great, and more will come." Anyway, I met the rabbi afterwards, and I opened my mouth. And I said, "If you're not going to allow the women to be part of the synagogue on the pulpit, why do we teach them the same? Let's teach them how to make gefilte fish and chicken soup. And then we'll have a good relationship." And so he finally gave in, and he said, all right, you can have an aliyah. And I went up on the bima at that time and had an aliyah.
I'm sorry, did you say what year was that?
Well, after Grandpa, no, that was when Grandpa died.
When Grandpa died.
So it was in the 70s.
It was in the 70s.
79.
79, okay.
My name is Rich Moline. I'm the child present she didn't mention. The middle child, of course. I just want to tell a very quick story about Rabbi Frankel of blessed memory. I had the privilege of having a conversation with him towards the end of his life. I didn't have very strong memories of him because he left before my bar mitzvah, but he was telling me about his involvement in the civil rights movement. And when he went to Selma, he had asked the congregation to pay for his airplane ticket. And seems like a silly conversation these days, but there was a contentious, times were different, there was a contentious debate at the board meeting. He was in the other room. Finally, the president, I think it may have been Jerry Rivlin, came out and said that the board had agreed to pay for his plane ticket to Selma, and he looked at it and said, "Tell me, is it one way?"
My name is Vern Gideon. I joined the same time as the lady up. I just want to make a general comment. synagogues make decisions and boards make decisions, and sometimes you agree with what they come up with, and sometimes you don't agree. And synagogues have their ups and downs. And I would just say that in all the years that we have been members, this has still always been our place. It's always been our home. Whether I have agreed with every decision or not, or it doesn't really make any difference. It still comes down to the fact that this is the home that we've chosen religiously and socially and communally, and this is our Kehillah, and you don't always need to agree with every single thing that comes out of administration.
Remember your mother.
Thank you. My name is Marilyn Mittman. Some of you may know the Mittman family less than Jerry. Mittman, I have 5 children, go through Hebrew school.
When did you join?
In the early 60s. My son Les was born in 52. And we lived just 2 blocks away from the synagogue in the new development. The T-Blooms were south of Glenview, and we were north of where Bell's School is now. And I wanted to give a thank you to Rabbi Stanford, who was the educational director here, who taught my son Les, who became principal of several Hebrew schools, and worked his way through college teaching bar and bat mitzvah. One of his most prominent students was Rahm Emanuel. And so I think that was funny. But I wanted to say something about the building of just New Trier very shortly. We were involved in that. My next door neighbor was Christian, married to a Jewish woman. He was a member of the Rifle Club, which were all Christian men. So he got all the gossip of what was going on in the Christian political community. And he told me the fight that they were putting up against building New Trier because they didn't want those people in where their kids were going. You know, they wanted the East New Trier thing. And they showed a map of the gerrymander, as this other woman said, of where they made the boundaries. And it was really critical. It was like this, like where you could go east, where you could go west. Those were the communities that did not want New Trier West built. And later on in the Wilmette Life, finally, there was an article written by a woman who sent in, we didn't want those people in our area because they will only bring down the grade point average. Yes, they didn't know the Jewish community, but it finally was built.
Thank you.
Jeremy, I don't remember what year we joined.
64, 65.
Yeah, all right, thank you. But it was, my children were bar and bat mitzvah here, some were married here, and it's always been, and I come all the way down from Highland Park because Beth Hillel is always in my heart. And I remember when we used to have to walk to the theater on the various holidays. In those days, I didn't ride, and back and forth the children went. And I remember when they counted me as in the Minion, I was number 11. We've made a long way, and it's a wonderful synagogue, and it always will be.
Great. I promise there will be time for more reminiscing informally. Does anybody have a particular question for the panel? Because otherwise I'm going to pose one. So, and then we'll start to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Jim Stoller, joined in the 1990s. Quick question, this is for Shelley, who probably knows the most. I've been asked this many times, why does the synagogue, the main synagogue, face the direction it does versus east?
Because the land had a problem with water. And when they started to dig to see exactly what existed, exactly what existed, that particular area where we normally would have had the sanctuary facing the proper direction was land soaked, and they said, you're taking a big chance. So they reversed the plan, and that's where we're at.
So as many of you may know, this is not at all unusual. Many American synagogues, including Orthodox synagogues, face the wrong way because of architectural and landscaping constraints. Because somebody mentioned it, I want to just mention the educational directors. Obviously, in addition to sisterhood presidents on the now missing chart up there, I think it's important, we will add these. So Rabbi Nathaniel Stamfer, I know is remembered well by a lot of people. I think he was here from 1962 to about 1966. Mayor Markowitz succeeded him for, I think, a year. David Cohen, then from 68 to 70, and Theodore Weiss from 72 through the end of the period we're talking about. Rabbi Stamfer, if I'm not mistaken, is closely related also to a very important Israeli scholar named Shaul Stamfer. A little bit of Jewish geography there. I want to pose one question to the entire panel, though, just go around. What is most noticeable in terms of changes in the congregation to you? What is most different today than when you first joined the congregation? The size, interestingly, except for the very beginning, has been roughly stable. It's sort of been upper mid-size by conservative standards, never huge like Anshe Emet or Bethel. But I'm wondering what strikes you as the biggest changes over time?
Well, physically, initially there wasn't much of a building. We used to meet for high holidays at the old Orchard Theater. I think another big change is how prominent the women are now compared to what I remember in the early days in the late 1950s.
I guess the most striking change to me is the reduction in the number of children. When our kids were in Hebrew school, there were 2 classes in each grade, at least, and now that's not so. I think the congregation is also showing more diversity, ethnically, racially, which I think is a really good and interesting thing. Also, there's been a change because so many more women work now than was the case when we were young and joined, and as a result, you have a different kind of constituency in the sisterhood boards. So those are some of the changes. But I have to give a shout out, though, to Muriel, Ira's mother, because Muriel was the caterer for all our simchas, and she was also a code word in our house when our kids were old enough to be maybe thinking seriously about dating someone. I would say, "Is it time to call Muriel?" And they knew what we meant.
That's tough for me because I'm not. Yeah, and I'm not actively involved in the same way anymore, so I don't want to speak out of turn in any way. Rabbi Annie Tucker, of course, the first female rabbi. That's monumental, and I know that Sam Pfeffer was outspoken on her behalf in her favor at the meeting, from what I hear. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Well, I would agree with, from the time I started here in Hebrew school in 1960, becoming an egalitarian synagogue really, really important for me. Rabbi Tucker, my tennis partner, I'm glad that she's here and part of this change. And really, those are the important things for me.
I do have a thought. I think that when I was a kid, in the early years, a synagogue served all the functions of a person's life. Social, religious, educational. It was the center of a family's. Often not. And again, I'm speaking through a child's lens, so correct me if I'm. But I think that people are way more torn. Not just that women work and that most families are 2-income now, and need to be. But that people are involved in so many more. There's so many more organizations pulling on them and tugging on them, and there doesn't seem to be that same sort of centrality that a synagogue had in people's lives. So for me, that seems like a significant change.
I believe this in my heart, that when I talked about the youth group softball team, and we played with all the adults, so there was the men's club softball team in the same league as the youth group softball team. I was 13 when it was started. And I think this softball team is one of the major places, a group of people that changed the culture of Wilmette, because we got the beat down, anti-Semitic-wise, physically, because everybody was bigger than us, until by the time I was a senior in high school, we were so good, because we were the same team year after year of really good ball players, until we started giving the beat down to everybody else. And I'm going to say St. Joe's because I still dislike that church, sorry to say, but they were the worst anti-Semitics of anybody. And when we started giving them the beat down, it changed their perspective on the Jew boys that they were playing against. And all of a sudden, as the years went on, and I played till I was 50 years old, and with some of the same St. Joe people against, I should say, they really gave us respect after that. So I think that's a small part of the change in culture here in Wilmette, was that youth group baseball team.
So, there's been a lot of talk about the negative. I have to say, on the positive, many of the early members remember, I believe it was the first congregational church of Wilmette, I should say, opening its doors to creating classrooms and being kind enough to remove all religious icons from them. So there was also a very positive side to inter-religious relations here. So I am willing to stay as long as anyone wants. In just a moment, we're going to conclude the formal program. I know lots of people need to leave. If there's food there, take it. I may have mentioned before, but I want to say again, I'm now involved with a project with Hillary in the office and others to put a full version of this timeline on the Beth Hillel website, and we're hoping to do it in a way that in effect will allow crowdsourcing or something like that, meaning you will be able to put your own hyperlink, and will help obviously if you want, through the entire history, pictures, articles. We've got lots of artifacts already, and if folks have things they want to share, that'll be a really good way to do it with scans and other things like that. So with that, in terms of, again, the formal program, I really want to thank our wonderful panelists. I want to have you hang around and talk if there's food, but thank you all for